Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. And to use another phrase from the UK, now for something completely different. So thank you to Sarah and your team for putting on this excellent conference. I'm so glad to be here. My name is Kyle Pearce. I'm VP for Community and Community Integration for Inspire Resources. And I'm coming to you from the traditional territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, otherwise known as Vancouver, BC. And today, I would like to provide what I would call a non-technical briefing. It's really part observation, part research, part integration. And our brief journey will start with British Columbia's adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and what's happening now. We'll discuss the gap between the expectations or hopes of miners and those of First Nations. We'll situate this in the context of the historical and contemporary legacy of colonialism in Canada. And we'll discuss strategies to understand how many in the mining industry see these changes and how we can leverage UNDRIP for greater and more meaningful change. Okay, so FPIC, or Free, Prior, and Informed Consent, is a core element of UNDRIP, which stands for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. In Canada, the federal government has a constitutional duty that predates UNDRIP to consult Indigenous groups and First Nations when their treaty rights may be affected by development. And by contrast, UNDRIP holds that governments must obtain free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories or other resources. So it's a broader sense of consent and for a broader range of purposes. So BC was the first jurisdiction in Canada to adopt UNDRIP, and the province's intention to implement it was signaled by the passing of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act and the related plan, which sets out the existing laws that will be aligned with UNDRIP. Now, one of those laws relates to the way that miners can stake a claim in BC. And currently, virtually anybody with a computer and $60 can stake a claim anywhere in the province, including on traditional and treaty territories. That's called the Provincial Mineral Tenure Act. Now, last year, two First Nations, the Gitxaala and Ahatasat, took the government to court asking for the standard of FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, to be applied when a claim is staked. Now, they didn't win that decision, but the court agreed that the current system violates the federal government's duty to consult. And the court gave the province 18 months to rewrite the Mineral Tenure Act in consultation with First Nations and industry partners. Now, while this process is underway, a dialogue has opened up about what this could mean. So we'll talk about industry expectations. First of all, the mining industry hopes to see incremental progress. Things like earlier and meaningful consultation, faster permitting, maintenance of what's been traditionally seen as the balance between the interests of First Nations and companies. And they probably hope that the federal and provincial government's interest in critical minerals will continue to ensure that it'll be easy to stake and explore claims. Miners are most comfortable with government determining the terms of participation, decision-making, and permitting. Now, an alternative perspective is also developing. This list of expectations comes from the BC First Nations Energy and Mining Council, as well as dialogue with Indigenous miners and allies that we at Inspire Resources hosted in 2023. So this list includes what I would call qualitative changes, such as veto powers for First Nations, profit sharing directly based on cash flows, rethinking the economics and purpose of mining to include long-term sustainable community development, and full participation in permitting, as well as capacity, giving resources to First Nations so they have the capacity to do this work. Now, there is a qualitative difference between what industry hopes and the expectations of First Nations. First Nations want a much more expansive requirement for consent and are seeking to have more control over what happens in their territories. They want significant economic benefits without the environmental damage. So how do we reconcile these two different sets of expectations? And how do we manage the risk that is inherent in the conflict between the two? At the end of the day, many in the industry want check boxes, and instead we'll probably need to unlearn what we've learned, especially the biases that contribute to the gap that we're seeing. We'll also need to practice new ways of thinking and interacting. Heather McGhee's book, The Sum of Us, details how in the United States, many poor white people make decisions based on racism that reduce their own quality of living. So she uses examples of white workers voting against a union because they perceived that Black workers would benefit. Or the destruction of public swimming pools during desegregation because they would allow Black people to swim together with white people, of course, eliminating the swimming pool for white people as well. So any change requires that we unlearn a dominant multiple model. And many of us believe that we live in a zero-sum world. That's what the title refers to, that there are winners and losers in mining, that gaining an advantage is done to the disadvantage of others. And we see that companies resist transparency and community control. So this is a colonial mentality, and it's reinforced by prejudices and biases we've learned. So how do we shift to a non-zero-sum world? I'll talk briefly about this social media trend right now called bear versus man. Some of you may have heard about it. It goes like this. Ask a man this question. If you had a daughter or a female partner or spouse and she was left in the forest, would you rather she be left with a bear or a man? Ask a woman, and you'll usually get a very different answer. So this is the big conversation in social media around bear versus man. It's an exercise designed to elicit understanding among men of the danger that men pose to women. It's helped some men to come to the realization that even we, as a man, speaking as a man, get that men are a worse danger to women than wild animals. The statistics bear that out, and in conversations, however, your mileage may vary. It also shows that the differential understanding of power comes from different experiences of power. So the kind of changes that Indigenous people want to see with UNDRIP are driven by their experience of centuries of colonization. We need to find ways to bridge the gap so that miners can understand the power differential between colonial systems and Indigenous systems, and questions that draw our attention to the implicit understanding of power, like the bear versus man question, can help. Other strategies for reconciling worldviews. Well, Daniel Francis's book, The Imaginary Indian, details the way that Indigenous people have been represented to reinforce the legitimacy of discrimination against and control over Indigenous people here in Canada. It challenges us to confront the formation and maintenance of discriminatory attitudes about Indigenous people. Now, most of us here in the Responsible Raw Materials community have had some revelation, I suspect, in our life that has driven us to embrace the kind of change that we're talking about today. Other ways we can help others in the industry are to ask reflective questions or conduct thought experiments. So reflective questions can help people to become more open or vulnerable, and through sharing in a safe environment, we can move through a critical reflection on our formative experiences. Thought experiments are ways of imagining a different world and activating the cerebral cortex instead of the amygdala. They don't require the same level of safety, but they do require someone to push us towards rigorous thinking and discussion. So I want to pose a question to all of you for silent reflection, or if you want to put your response in the chat. What personal experience did you have that changed your perspective on mining so that you now embrace a different vision for the industry? Okay, there's so many issues to unpack with FPIC, and I just want to highlight three of them here as we wrap this up. One is, our relationship to each other. Mining companies have come to rely on certainty, and certainty means control. We, meaning people like me with an English and French background here in Canada, have exercised control through a dominant and dominating set of laws and rules. Western and Indigenous conceptions of our relationship with the land are pretty much oppositional. In my culture, land's something to be owned exclusively for personal benefit or economic value. Many Indigenous cultures see themselves as part of a web that is connected to the land, water, and air. The relationship is dynamic and multi-directional. A benefit to one is a benefit to all. And finally, we've created a zero-sum world where basic needs even are only available to those with the means to pay for them. So if we are able to go down this road to decolonizing mining and bringing in FPIC, we believe, if we rethink our relationship with rights holders and shareholders, we can also rethink our relationships with our companies, the land, and shift the context in the industry. It requires some internal thinking, so that bear versus man question is germane to mining. Mining has a terrible record of recruiting and retaining women workers. A lot of reasons are because the glass ceiling, but many women that I've spoken with feel fearful in many working situations in the industry. So we can boost recruitment and retention by building a sense of belonging for all workers. We can expedite the development of resources and reduce the number of abandoned mine claims. And we can achieve true sustainability, not just for global economy, but also for small communities. This is what Heather McGee refers to as the solidarity dividend, the improvements that come from unlearning our biases and prejudices, and then aligning our laws, policies, and institutions with them. And that is my presentation. I just need to figure out how to stop sharing here.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Kyle. Round of applause, everybody, for Kyle. And Kyle, you'll be glad to know that we've begun to get some answers to your question in the chat already. I think, Kyle, just a reflection from me. So when you were talking about that bear or man question, I confess I haven't heard of this yet, and it's floored me at the moment. And I think looking at Ludovina's face, Ludovina is in the same boat. Can you describe that a little bit more, because it obviously hasn't quite made its way over the Atlantic to those of us here in the UK and Europe?
Well, yeah, so it started out as something I saw on my Threads stream, which is a TikTok video where a woman is asking her husband, they're just lying in bed and relaxing, and she asks him, if we had to leave our daughter in the woods, would you rather leave them with a bear or with a man? And the husband asks all sorts of questions. Well, what do we know about the bear? Are they aggressive? Are they hungry? What do we know about the man? Do we know them? And so forth. And it's like, no, you don't know anything about either the bear or the man. And so he goes through this process. He actually articulates the thought process and ends up going, well, actually, I'd probably be more comfortable with leaving them with a bear. And so she says, if you had a choice between leaving your daughter with a bear or a woman, which would you choose? And he immediately says, well, that's a no-brainer. I would leave them with the woman. And so it spurred this conversation. Of course, a lot of men saying, not all men are not me, and those kinds of things. But it spurred a deeper conversation about how vulnerable women are with men. And so when we think about mining, it's absolutely appropriate to think about, how we train men to respect the personal space, the auditory space of women to protect their safety and create a sense of belonging for everyone, not just for women, people of color, visible minorities, and other groups. So I think those kind of questions for me it's obviously a very provocative thing, at least on this side of the ocean.
Yeah, no, thank you for that explanation there, Kyle. I think that's really important. And Yeah, I mean, I think even still now, I run lots of sessions with different, often smaller mining companies around the world. And it's interesting because sometimes when someone is brave enough to say, actually, I sometimes feel pretty vulnerable in that situation, you do get people rolling their eyes still during those sessions rather than going, oh, well, I'm concerned about that and I'm curious. Tell me more. So we've still got a way to travel, perhaps, with regards to those aspects. Kyle, let's dive into, I loved your slide that you showed where it's, mining companies or people want the checkbox, but the reality is this. You had the picture of the human face with the kind of the back of the head fading off into the distance with different bits there. And I mean, I think this is something where a lot of us are involved in trying to put together, say, guidance with regards to be it sustainability or how do we look at our different mineral resources. And there's that tipping point between being very prescriptive with what you want everybody to do. So there's standardization versus something that is more principle based. And so therefore it's flexible enough to fit into anybody's context. Do you want to just expand a little bit more on that? Because this flex backwards and forwards between the tick box or perhaps the standardization versus the, we all know the rules, so do what's intended, perhaps does flex. Have I interpreted what you were saying correctly, or am I on a different
Yeah.
path?
No, absolutely. And I figured you'd like the checkbox, because every time I've seen you and Matt and your team speak, you talk about checkboxes and moving beyond checkboxes. But the reality is that, most organizations are comprised of people who like and are comfortable making decisions, and other people who like and are comfortable having decisions made for them. And so the question around the change paradigm is, there's so many. One is how do you change that? But I think the most important part is where do you start? And the people who are most likely to start, I mean, sometimes you get surprised by people who will be expressive of an innovative approach, even though they're, fairly linear people and not terribly broadly minded. But I think the important part is to start the dialogue and have the conversations at different levels of different levels of companies.
Mhm.
And eventually, it's the whole chicken and egg, which is what changes behavior? Is it the policy, or does the behavior start or the conversation start first? And in reality, these are self-perpetuating machines. We just need to start intervening somewhere.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think that this is something where, as someone who gets to play in the very exciting world of risk management on a regular basis, so routinely do we see, especially the larger companies, trying to check boxes and thinking just because they've ticked a box, they're now safe, or they're going to make the money or keep their social license or whatever it might be. Whereas actually, risk management is almost the polar opposite to ticking boxes. It's actually the opportunity to open up some of that uncertain world and challenge it and try and think beyond those models. At least that's how I see it. Maybe that's why we always create chaos. But Kyle, thank you so, so much. Absolutely brilliant as always. Everyone, please put your hands together for the wonderful Kyle Pearce. Thank you very much.